الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين ونصلي ونسلم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. نعم, so moving on, we were going through the discussion regarding what is jarh اصطلاحا, and we'll just repeat the definition once again. The definition was وصف الراوي في عدالته أو ضبطه بما يقتضي تليين روايته أو تضعيفها أو ردها. And we spoke about تليين. The second one is أو تضعيف. يعني what is, when we say a rawi is, or claiming that a rawi is given a quality that would request or require that we do taḍʿīf of his riwayah. What does that mean? So we mentioned talīyn is very close to the center and easily it can be accepted. As for taḍʿīf, what does that entail? So he says, والموصوف بما يقتضي تضعيف روايته لا يخلو تضعيفه من ثلاث حالات. يعني we say jarh is that we describe a rawi in a way that either we're doing talīyn of his riwayah or we're doing taḍʿīf of his riwayah. تضعيف will mean one of three scenarios. Number one, al-ula. So taḍʿīf as well is not all the same exact scenario or all the same level. Rather, there are different levels in taḍʿīf. He says الأولى أن يكون تضعيفا مطلقا فهذا لا تقبل معه رواية الراوي عند تفرده بها ولكن تتقوى بالمتابعة من مثله فترتقي إلى حسن لغيره. The first one is that it's تضعيف مطلق. مطلق meaning in all states, in all scenarios. Like in the next one he's going to mention that it's مقيد, يعني it's in specific scenarios that he's considered ضعيف. So the first one is that he's considered ضعيف مطلقا. مطلقا meaning unrestricted in all scenarios. What's the حكم if you were to claim that a rawi is ضعيف from this perspective? We say فهذا لا تقبل معه رواية الراوي عند تفرده بها. If the rawi is narrating and he is the only one narrating this riwayah, then in that situation this riwayah will not be accepted. ولكن تتقوى بالمتابعة من مثله. However, if he is supported, meaning if the narration is corroborated with another riwayah of another rawi who is of his equal, then this will give enough strength that it can become Hasan لغيره. And you guys studied Al-Hasan للغير in نخبة الفكر. He says وأمثلة هذا النوع كثيرة وهو الغالب في هذه الحالات الثلاث. Yani this example, there's many of them, and that is the majority state in the three, or from the three scenarios of taḍʿīf that he mentions. That is number one. So again, in this scenario, so it's not the same as talīyn. In talīyn we said what? تتقوى روايته بوجود قرينة مرجح. Yani his riwayah itself will be considered stronger if there's a qarina that he developed of that specific narration. Right? He actually retained that narration. So the difference between, like if you ask in this scenario of taḍʿīf, in the first scenario of taḍʿīf and the scenario of talīyn, what's the difference? What's the difference? So we say in this scenario of talīyn, we don't have to look at other riwayat. We're not looking at mutaba'at. We're not looking at external factors. We're looking at the rawi himself. And just by looking at the rawi himself, looking at the state of the rawi himself, we're actually able to give it, we're able to find qara'in that the rawi himself got it right. So the riwayah internally is able to get stronger. As for the first level of taḍʿīf, that is where internally the riwayah is not getting stronger. You actually are looking at a mutaba'ah. So in of itself, there's no way, because the rawi is considered ضعيف mutlaqan. In of itself, there's no way that we can say that this riwayah can, for example, become stronger. But because of an external factor, which is a separate riwayah altogether, which is what we call mutaba'ah, through mutaba'ah, the riwayah was able to gain strength and it was able to become strong enough to attain al-husn lil-ghayr, or hasan li-ghayrihi. طيب. There's a question that arises though, which is that in reality, when we look at riwayat, we never ever look at them individually. Like this is the qawaid over here are in order to make sense of this approach or the concept of what's taking place. But in reality, riwayat are never looked at individually. Riwayat are always looked at as a collective whole. So when we are separating in the actual study phase into individual scenarios, that is only for that phase. In reality, in actuality, in practical application, riwayat are always looked at as a whole. That's why they always say, الباب إذا لم يجمع طرقه لم تتبين علته. Any given chapter, as long as you haven't gathered all of its turuq, then its illah is not going to become clear. Meaning the actual situation or what's going on with that hadith will not be clarified. And this is really important too when it comes to al-hukm al-hadith. You keep in mind, عدم التسارع. Don't rush. Don't be hasty. Al-ujla, meaning being hasty, just looking at one, two things, that's very, very dangerous when it comes to tasheeh and taḍʿīf. You have to take your time. You have to keep on thinking of all of the possible scenarios. And before you even think of the possible scenarios, you have to gather all of the riwayat in the bab. That itself can take a long time. Now, how do you gather all those riwayat? We're going to talk about that inshallah ta'ala in the course which is takhrij. Inshallah, we're going to teach takhrij, and in takhrij we'll learn how to gather all these riwayat. But once you've gathered all the riwayat, only after that you move to the next step, which is now you start looking at the qara'in, even looking at the ruwat and looking at their levels and so on and so forth. This only happens after you gather all of the riwayat. طيب. This is the first level of تضعيف. الثانية, the second level of تضعيف. He says أن يكون تضعيفا مقيدا بالرواية عن بعض الشيوخ أو في بعض البلدان أو في بعض الأوقات فيختص الضعف بما قيد به دون سواه. يا سلام. The second scenario is a rawi who is ضعيف, however مقيدا, in specific situations. Maybe this rawi is ضعيف from this specific sheikh. And in of itself, the rawi is ثقة. But when he narrates from this sheikh, then he's ضعيف. Or in specific buldan. Now that could be the rawi himself narrating from teachers from a specific country, or students from a specific country narrating from that rawi. We'll give examples of this inshallah. That's another scenario. Or في بعض الأوقات. Sometimes, maybe throughout his life, towards the end of his life, he became ضعيف. Before that, he was sahih. So this is ضعيف nisbi. This is relative ضعف. طيب. Look into حاشية. قال ابن رجب في شرح علل الترمذي قوم ثقات في أنفسهم لكن حديثهم عن بعض الشيوخ فيه ضعف بخلاف حديثهم عن بقية شيوخهم وهؤلاء جماعة كثيرون وسيذكر منهم المؤلف. Now, the author himself will mention a group of these individuals as well. They're a large group of people that they are ثقات by default. However, their ahadith from specific shuyukh are considered ضعيف. طيب, why from specific shuyukh? Everyone has a different situation. Maybe, for example, like we said, becoming thiqah does not mean that you have to memorize everything. You could also become thiqah by way of having it in a book. But let's say you had a book from a certain teacher, and you didn't lose all your books, you only lost some of your books. So you lost some books from that entails specific ahadith of specific teachers. Now, when you lose those specific books, what ends up happening is that you become da'if if you narrate from that teacher specifically. But the rest of the books, you still have them. The rest of the books, you still have them. So you'll still be considered a thiqah overall. نعم. And likewise, قال ابن رجب في شرح علل الترمذي. طيب, شرح علل الترمذي is a really good book that should be read. And really, we're going to talk about this more inshallah when we do علل بإذن الله تعالى. But there are some books that are absolutely golden, and this is from them. This is from amongst those books. Because they teach you the maratib of the thiqat, the different levels of the ruwat that are all considered thiqah. And it teaches you regarding not only their levels, how do we make sure that, or how do we deal with the thiqat when they differ in the narration? And that is really the essence of ilal. طيب, so what does he say? قال ابن رجب في شرح علل الترمذي من ضعف حديثه في بعض الأماكن دون بعض وهو على ثلاثة أضرب. So Ibn Rajab actually says that this category, which is في بعض البلدان, further divides into 3 categories. Number 1, he said الضرب الأول من حدث في مكان لم تكن معه فيه كتبه فخلط. نعم. وحدث في مكان آخر من كتبه فضبط. يا سلام. This is a very common situation. Someone narrates in a specific area, but he didn't have his books with him. Maybe he was visiting. And there's students that came in and said, we want to listen to your hadith. And he's trying to say no, but then, they keep telling him they want to listen to his hadith. So he ends up narrating in a specific area, but he didn't have his books with him. So because of that, he made a mistake. But when he's normally narrating, when he has his books, then in that situation he's not making mistakes. طيب. That's one scenario. أو سمع في مكان من شيخ فلم يضبط عنه وسمع منه في موضع آخر فضبط. Now, this is even more interesting. That he listens in one area from a certain sheikh. فلم يضبط. But in that area, he was not able to retain the narrations properly. Maybe, for example, he misheard, or maybe, for example, he didn't have his books, or maybe he was just in a state where he wasn't able to do it. But that same sheikh, elsewhere, he heard from that sheikh, and he was able to attain dhabt. So now this becomes really interesting, which is that if he's narrating from that sheikh, we're saying in certain scenarios we can trust it, in certain scenarios we can't trust it. How do we know which scenario it is, though? So, again, it can become a lot more detailed. طيب, he says فمنهم معمر بن راشد حديثه بالبصرة فيه اضطراب كثير وحديثه باليمن جيد. What's the story of معمر بن راشد? معمر بن راشد al-Basri was initially from Basra, and he traveled to Yemen. And over there, he became a student of Abdul Razak al-San'ani. And the people of Yemen, they liked him. So what's the best way to keep someone somewhere? To get him married to someone from that place. So they had him married to someone from Yemen. So then he ended up staying in Yemen. And he stayed in Yemen for a long time. And he's the main student of Abdul Razak al-San'ani. The Musannaf of Abdul Razak is mainly transmitted from Ma'mar and Abdul Razak. No, Abdul Razak narrates from Ma'mar. Abdul Razak was his main student. معلش. Abdul Razak is the main student of who? Ma'mar ibn Rashid. And so Abdul Razak and Ma'mar, نعم. And Abdul Razak is from where? In Yemen, in Sana'a. طيب. Now, Ma'mar ibn Rashid, in Yemen, he had his books because that's where he lived and he was married there. And so all of the students that would narrate from him in Yemen, they would seek the narrations from him while he would be reading off of his books. Or at least he would have his books to reference. Meaning he wasn't solely relying on his memory. He wasn't solely relying on his memory. However, after some time he traveled to Basra. And when he traveled to Basra, over there, why did he travel to Basra? To meet his mother. But obviously when you're traveling, you're not able to take all your books. So he didn't travel with his books. He traveled himself. And over there, his mother, to meet him, or he met his mother, but there were students over there that wanted to listen to his ahadith. And they came to him and they requested him to transmit ahadith and to narrate the ahadith for him. And he accepted. But he made mistakes because he didn't have his books. So now, when you see the narration of Ma'mar, we see who is the one narrating from Ma'mar. Who is the one narrating from Ma'mar? Is he from Yemen or is he from Basra? If he's from Basra, now we don't immediately say it's wrong, but we see who else narrated this same hadith from Ma'mar from Yemen, if we can find any. Have any other students of Ma'mar also narrated this hadith from people in Yemen or some from other places, for example? If we can find it, then we look. Is it the same? Yani the one that's narrated in Basra, is it the same as the one which is narrated elsewhere by students other than the ones from Basra? If it's the same, then we say that's fine. That there's nothing wrong with that hadith because the same exact version was found by a student who was from Yemen. But if it's different, that's where it gets interesting. So over here we say that if the student is narrating from him and he's from Yemen, then that's an indication that that one is mahfuz and the one from Basra is ghair mahfuz. But let's say nobody else narrates this hadith from Ma'mar other than the students from one student from Basra or multiple students from Basra. It could be multiple too. It doesn't make a difference over here. Let's say no one else narrates this hadith from Ma'mar, from Yemen, for example. The only students that are narrating from him are from Basra. Do we immediately reject it? So we say no, we have to look further. Are there other students that are narrating from the teacher of Ma'mar? So let's say there's like 5 students from Basra that are narrating from Ma'mar, and Ma'mar narrates from a certain teacher, this narration. Like, does this teacher have other students that are narrating the same narration from him, other than Ma'mar? If we find those narrations, then we have to compare this version with those narrations. And if it ends up being aligned with them, then again, you can accept it. Because al-aslu fiha annahu thiqa. But if it ends up being different, then it raises a question mark. It raises a question mark. This is the general discussion regarding Ma'mar ibn Rashid, where he made certain mistakes when he traveled to Basra and he narrated over there. So what's interesting is, if you remember, I said that really, what are the logical premises that go behind all of these? And these qawaid, really, they're just purely logical qawaid, right? The question is it possible that someone from Basra could have traveled to Iraq and heard a hadith from Ma'mar, or someone from Basra could have traveled to Yemen and heard a hadith from Ma'mar in Yemen, as opposed to Basra? But he's Basri, but he traveled to Yemen and he heard it in Yemen. Is that mumkin? The answer is na'am, mumkin. Is it possible that someone from Yemen could have been there while Ma'mar was in Basra and he heard the hadith from Ma'mar while he was in Basra? Mumkin. And this is all possible. However, if that was to happen, we see most likely it would have been recorded. We would have known that Fulan heard from Ma'mar, like in the tarjum of either Fulan or Fulan. Like it would have been mentioned, Fulan traveled and so on and so forth. Like, is it possible it happened and it wasn't mentioned? Mumkin. Okay. But the hukum over here is based on aghlab. Yani, what do you think is the more probable scenario? Okay, so again, it goes back to the same qawaid that the fuqaha are using and the usuliyun are using. Really, the logical premises are the same, which is that غلبة الظن تنزل منزلة اليقين. Over here as well, we use غلبة الظن. We use the more probable scenario, and based on that, we establish the hukum. As for arriving at certainty, that the ilm al-hadith is not based or it's not developed based on achieving certainty regarding these matters. طيب. This was Ma'mar ibn Rashid. Then he says الضرب الثاني. So this is the example of an individual who gave tahdith, or he did tahdith in one place and he didn't have his books over there and therefore he made a mistake. The second type, or the second category, he says الضرب الثاني من حدث عن أهل مصر أو إقليم فحفظ حديثهم وحدث عن غيرهم فلم يحفظ. طيب, this is also possible. And there's a rawi who narrates from certain shuyukh from a certain country. We find that whenever he narrated from these shuyukh, alhamdulillah, حفظ حديثهم, and he remembered their hadith. But when he's narrating from other shuyukh from other countries, he hasn't memorized or he hasn't remembered them. He says فمنهم إسماعيل بن عياش الحمصي أبو عتبة إذا حدث عن الشاميين فحديثه عنهم جيد وإذا حدث عن غيرهم فحديثه مضطرب. Okay, he says هذا مضمون ما قاله الأئمة فيه منهم أحمد ويحيى والبخاري وأبو زرعة. طيب, is this possible? The answer is yes. Now, this could also be because of a number of different reasons. For example, it might be that he had, or he was going through something in his life, for example, that distracted him while he was narrating from scholars elsewhere, other than that specific area where he was known to be strong. That is mumkin. It's possible that in that specific balad, for example, he had ashab who, for example, might have recorded what the sheikh said better, and he was simply using their, like maybe he was not able to write fast enough, and the sheikh is obviously doing imla, the sheikh is simply saying the narration. If you can't write fast enough, then you might forget. So maybe, for example, he was in one place listening to the sheikh with an entire jama'ah, and therefore whatever he did forget, he was able to compare it with his friends or his companions who were also there as students of that same sheikh, and he was able to make sure that he got it all right. Whereas in another place, he was the one alone that was listening to the sheikh, or he wasn't able to do that process, for example. There are a number of different factors or reasons that can result in this as well. He says, الضرب الثالث من حدث عنه أهل مصر أو إقليم فحفظوا حديثه وحدث عنه غيرهم فلم يقيموا حديثه فمنهم زهير بن محمد الخراساني ثم المكي يكنى أبا المنذر ثقة متفق على تخريج حديثه مع أن بعضهم ضعفه وفصل الخطاب في حاله في حال رواياته أن أهل العراق يروون عنه أحاديث مستقيمة وما خرج عنه في الصحيح فمن رواياتهم عنه وأهل الشام يروون عنه روايات منكرة. نعم, this is really interesting too. This راوي زهير بن محمد الخراساني ثم المكي, his kunya is Abu al-Munzir. He says he is a thiqah. Okay. متفق على تخريج حديثه, even though some have done تضعيف of him. طيب. He says the reason why is because the Ahlul Iraq, the Iraqiyun, when they narrate his ahadith, they narrate it correct. Yani it's funny that all the Iraqiyun are narrating his ahadith and the طيب, how do we determine that they're mustaqima? Yani what's the method of determining that they're mustaqima? We mentioned this previously. You cross compare it. Like, obviously he's not the only student who's narrating from his teachers. There's a lot of other students that are narrating from the teachers of Zuhair ibn Muhammad, okay, Abu al-Mundhir. There's a lot of other teachers that are narrating from his teachers, that he is narrating from. Yani, a lot of other teachers of Zuhair that Zuhair is narrating. The other students are narrating from them as well. So we compare the hadith of Zuhair from these teachers with the students of, we compare the hadith of Zuhair with the students, with the hadith of the students who are narrating from the same teachers as Zuhair is narrating from. We see. So over there, the muhaddithun determined that usually when the people of Iraq are narrating from Zuhair, then his hadith happened to be correct. But when other people are narrating from him, then his hadith happened to be incorrect. Like he's making mistakes. Like, who's the one? Is that mistake because of Zuhair? Or is it because of... Now, how do we determine whether the mistake is occurring because of Zuhair or is occurring because of the students themselves? Number one, if there's multiple students. So if you find all of the Iraqiyun narrating from him well, and you find all of the other scholars from other places narrating from him in a way which is not well, that usually is an indication that the mistake is coming from Zuhair. Why? Because if the mistake was from a student or even some students in other places, you wouldn't find all of them narrating wrong. You'd only find some of them. But when you see it, you see that, okay, the Iraqiyun end up narrating from him right. Ibn Rajab, he mentions something really interesting over here. He says, وَمَا خُرِّجَ عَنْهُ فِي الصَّحِيحِ فَمِنْ رِوَايَاتِهِمْ عَنْهُ. Now, one of you can search up, and how many ahadith, like, is he referring to Bukhari over here? If so, how many ahadith in Bukhari are narrated with this rawi in mind, which is Zuhair ibn Muhammad al-Khurasani thumma al-Makki? But what's the gharad over here? This mentions a really important point to us as well. That he says, whatever narration was narrated from Zuhair in as-Sahih, فَمِنْ رِوَايَاتِهِمْ عَنْهُ, is from the riwayat of the Iraqiyun from him. Yani, there could be an author whose only intention is to gather Sahih narrations, and that's it, nothing else. Now, in that, he knows that Zuhair is acceptable when the Iraqiyun are narrating from him. And he knows that he's not acceptable when other than the Iraqiyun are narrating from him. So according to him, yes, when the Iraqiyun narrate from him, the hadith is going to be Sahih. So he purposely brings narrations of Zuhair in his Sahih. But which narrations were the students of the Iraqiyun? What does this tell us? This indicates towards us something really interesting, which is the concept of intiqa. And in reality, all of the muhaddithun, they do intiqa. What is intiqa? Intiqa is to choose which riwayah to take of which rawi. Just because, so again, this is not black and white at all, guys. It's not like this rawi, whenever he comes authentic, yallah, that's it. That's not the way this works. There could be a thiqa rawi, the hadith could be daif. Or all the rawat could be thiqat, the hadith could still be daif. There could be a rawi who's daif, yet the hadith is sahih. Okay. So this is what we call the process of intiqa. Intiqa means that you're selecting which rawi to bring in which scenario. You are selecting when to bring a rawi and in what scenario should he be brought. Same thing with Ma'mar ibn Rashid. Ma'mar ibn Rashid, for example, is also an authentic narrator. Okay, so you have muhaddithun that understand this very well. They very well understand in which situation is the narrator accepted, in which situation is the narrator not accepted. And their intiqa is not at a small level. It's at a very deep level. And so when you're studying books like Bukhari, inshallah, and Muslim, for example, you keep in mind that especially from a hadith perspective, that the musannifin, meaning Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim rahimahullah ta'ala, they're doing intiqa a lot. It's not a little bit, it's quite often actually. How many times does Imam Bukhari bring riwayat of mudallisin in his sahih? Many mudallisin are brought. But yet he does intiqa. He does intiqa from the riwayat, what would determine, or those riwayat which he determines to be authentic. Yes, they're technically mudallisin, but he does intiqa. Likewise, Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala brings certain ruwat that are mukhtalaf fihim altogether. But yet he does intiqa. So the process of intiqa is a very, very normal procedure amongst the muhaddithun. It's a very normal procedure, and it's common, and every single hadith is looked at differently. Every single hadith is looked at individually. Let's search up, inshallah ta'ala, regarding a little bit regarding this Rawi, who is Zuhair bin Muhammad al-Khurasani, just so we can see how many riwayat or how many narrations are being brought in the books from this Rawi, and what type of narrators are the ones that are bringing those narrations. طيب, so we found regarding this Rawi, who is Zuhair bin Muhammad al-Khurasani, number one, a little bit regarding him. He is زهير بن محمد أبو المنذر التميمي الخراساني الأصل، المروزي المكي، ويقال النيسابوري. And he lives in a number of different cities, passed away in the year 162. And he has many riwayat, and he's not a normal or like muqil. He has around 431 riwayat as per what is mentioned in Jami' Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain. In Jami' Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain is also mentioned that in Bukhari and Muslim, he has two riwayats each. And he comes twice in Bukhari and he comes twice in Sahih Muslim as well. And with regards to the Jarḥ and Taʿdīl, meaning what the scholars of Jarḥ and Taʿdīl have said regarding him, there are some that said that he is Saduq. Okay. And Ibn Adi, he said in Al-Kamil fi al-Du'afa that وهذه الأحاديث لزهير بن محمد فيها بعض النكرة ورواية الشاميين عنه أصح من رواية غيرهم. Okay. Oh, interesting. He says ورواية الشاميين عنه أصح من رواية غيرهم وله غير هذه الأحاديث ولعل الشاميين حيث رووا عنه أخطأوا عليه فإنه إذا حدث عنه أهل العراق فرواياتهم عنه شبه المستقيمة وأرجو أنه لا بأس به. Okay, so same idea that the Iraqiyun, when they narrate from him, then it's usually acceptable. Otherwise, when the Iraqiyun and when the others are narrating, then it's problematic. طيب الحاكم, he mentioned in Tarikh Naysabur that احتج جميعا به, and he referring to Imam Bukhari and Muslim, that the both of them did the ihtijaj with him. طيب, but just we're gonna mention like Bukhari and Muslim who did the ihtijaj with him doesn't mean that you can always do ihtijaj with him. Inshallah, that will be discussed بإذن. Then we have Isa ibn Yunus and others, Ahmad ibn Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala. He says كأن الذي روى عنه أهل الشام زهير آخر. Interesting. So this is really interesting, which is that Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala is saying that maybe the Shawam, like when you have this discrepancy, right? When you have the Iraqi narrating it one way and the Shawam narrating it one way, then you think to yourself, like, are these really two people? Maybe they're two people. Maybe they're not actually the same Zuhair. Maybe they're referring to different individuals altogether. And because of that, in one scenario there is strength, in one scenario it is the opposite. نعم. قال أحمد كأن الذي روى عنه أهل الشام زهير آخر فقل لي باسمه سمعت ابن حماد يقول قال البخاري فذكر نحو هذا الكلام. And Imam Bukhari also said something similar regarding Zuhair. طيب. And Imam Bukhari in تهذيب الكمال is written ما روى عنه أهل الشام فإنه مناكير وما روى عنه أهل البصرة فإنه صحيح. And in Basriyun, when they narrate from him, it's Sahih. When the Shawam narrate from him, they're Manakir. Manakir, again, Munkar over here is going to come. These terms are going to come. Manakir is not referring to just completely for like, unacceptable, but it's referring to tafarrudat, a hadith that you don't find anywhere else. Gharaib. نعم. Al-Ijli says regarding him, جائز الحديث. In one place he says, لا بأس به. Ibn Hibban, he simply said, يخطئ ويخالف. But he did mention him كتاب الثقات. He did mention to him in كتاب الثقات. Ibn Hajjaj said regarding him ثقة إلا أن رواية أهل الشام عنه غير مستقيمة فضعف بسببها, and so on and so forth. So this is what we find the scholars saying regarding him. Now let's look at the hadith that are mentioned where in Bukhari and Muslim from this Rawi. So I said Imam Bukhari brought him, and Imam Muslim as well brings him twice. No. طيب. So in Bukhari you have hadith number 5641. where he says in Imam Bukhari, he says حدثني عبد الله بن محمد قال حدثنا عبد الملك بن عمرو قال حدثنا زهير بن محمد عن محمد بن عمرو. So عبد الملك بن عمرو قال حدثنا زهير بن محمد عن محمد بن عمرو بن حلحلة عن عطاء بن يسار عن أبي سعيد وأن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنهم عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال ما يصيب المسلم من نصب ولا وصب ولا هم ولا حزن ولا أذى ولا غم حتى الشوكة يشاكها إلا كفر الله بها من خطاياه. That is the narration that Imam Bukhari narrates, or he brings this narration. One of the ones that he brings. No. طيب, the second one is hadith number 6229, where he says حدثنا عبد الله بن محمد قال أخبرنا أبو عامر قال حدثنا زهير. طيب, and the first one is Abdul Malik ibn Amr. Second one is Abu Amir قال حدثنا زهير. طيب, let's look at exactly who these ruwat are. Who is Abu Amir? طيب, Abu Amir is Abdul Malik ibn Amr. So Abu Amir, he is Abdul Malik ibn Amr. So both of these ahadith that Imam Bukhari is narrating through this Rawi, he's narrating them from the same exact student. So there's one student, and Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala is resorting to this same student, Abdul Malik ibn Amr. Another interesting thing we can check is, now, like, it's interesting, Imam Bukhari relied on this student, right? He relied on Abdul Malik ibn Amr from Zuhair. So how many ahadith has Abdul Malik ibn Amr narrated from Zuhair? We can check that too. So Jami' al-Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain. Let's look up Abdul Malik ibn Amr. Okay, interesting. Abdul Malik ibn Amr narrated 126 ahadith, as per what's mentioned Jami' al-Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain, in the kutub that Jami' al-Khadim al-Haramain al-Sharifain has within it. 126 ahadith from Zuhair. So that means he's a mukthir, and he's a student that is commonly narrating from Zuhair. We can also look up Abdul Malik ibn Amr, who he is exactly. So Imam Bukhari, the point is, Imam Bukhari, both narrations of Zuhair that he brought in his Sahih, Abdul Malik ibn Amr was the Rawi. So we can also look up who this Rawi is exactly and regarding him. So he is number one from Al-Basri, and he's from Basra. That's number one. So he's narrating, Imam Bukhari is trusting Zuhair's narration when a Basri narrator is narrating from him, and he is thiqah. And Imam Bukhari brings other narrations of him in his Sahih as well. So in Abdul Malik ibn Amr, other than through Zuhair, and through other teachers, in Sahih al-Bukhari, he's mentioned around 24 times. طيب, Jameel. طيب, now we have, this is the one that's mentioned in Bukhari. But now another thing we can look is, what's the narrations that Imam Bukhari is bringing? Are these narrations that Imam Bukhari has already brought before, or are they solely dependent? So this also matters. And Imam Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala, is he bringing Zuhair ibn Amr and this narration through his tariq after having already brought this narration before, relying on someone else? Or maybe after him he brings this narration again, relying on someone else? So that's telling us that he's not only solely dependent upon Zuhair, if he were to do that. Let's check that inshallah ta'ala. So we have حديث number 6229. Imam Bukhari says حدثنا عبد الله بن محمد قال أخبرنا أبو عامر قال حدثنا زهير عن زيد بن أسلم عن عطاء بن يسار نعم عن أبي سعيد الخدري أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إياكم والجلوس بالطرقات فقالوا يا رسول الله ما لنا إلى آخر الحديث. The hadith after this is a separate bab. The hadith after this is a separate bab altogether. The hadith before this is the first hadith of the bab, 6228. And that Imam Bukhari brings, he says, قال أخبرنا أبو اليمان. لا, it's a different hadith. So it seems like Imam Bukhari is solely dependent upon Zuhair in this narration. The one that is 6229. So we can find, or we can look up the one which is we can look up the one which is in the previous one, which was 5641 as well, individually. So 5641, this is ما جاء في كفارة المرض وقول الله تعالى من يعمل سوءا يجزى به. So this narration, no. So he does mention the narration before the narration of Zuhair, 5640. He says حدثنا أبو اليمان قال نعم أخبرنا شعيب عن الزهري قال أخبرني عروة بن زبير أن عائشة رضي الله عنها زوج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قالت قال الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم ما من مصيبة تصيب المسلم إلا كفر الله بها عنه حتى الشوكة يشاكها. And then it brings the riwayah of Zuhair, which is a bit more extensive, which is from Abu Hurairah and Abu Sa'id: ما يصيب المسلم من نصب ولا وصب ولا هم ولا حزن ولا أذى ولا غم حتى الشوكة يشاكها إلا كفر الله بها من خطايا. And then he brings another narration from Abdullah ibn Ka'b عن أبيه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: مثل المؤمن كالخامة من الزرع. نعم. So in this ma'na, he's bringing a lot of narrations. A lot of narrations. As for the wording of حتى الشوكة يشاكها, that was mentioned by the narration or in the narration of Aisha radiallahu anha before that as well. طيب. Now let's look at Imam Muslim rahimahullah ta'ala. He also brings him twice. Hadith number 188, here where he says: حدثنا أبو بكر بن أبي شيبة قال حدثنا يحيى بن أبي بكير أو يحيى بن أبي بكير قال حدثنا زهير بن محمد عن سهيل بن أبي صالح. نعم. إن أدنى أهل الجنة منزلة. And then hadith number 211. نعم. Again, Yahya ibn Abi Bukayr. It's the same hadith actually. إن أدنى نعم. Wallahu alam, it seems like it's the same hadith, just different parts of it. So same exact chain. Suhail ibn Abi Salih, and Nu'man ibn Abi Abbas, and Abi Sa'id, and the second one as well. Same exact chain. So really, Imam Muslim is really bringing one narration. It's literally the same rijal, and just parts of the narration he mentioned in one place, and other parts of the narration he brought it elsewhere. But otherwise, it's the same exact rijal. نعم. نعم. So this narration as well, Imam Muslim rahimahullah ta'ala, is, we can say, is he's relying solely on Zuhair. But in this as well, the Rawi who's narrating, which is Yahya ibn Bukayr, he's also Al-Kufi. Al-Kufi, so also from Iraq. Al-Kufi, also from Iraq. طيب, we can also look up now, which is Zuhair ibn Muhammad. Let's see how many Yahya ibn Abi Bukayr narrates from him. How many narrations Yahya ibn Abi Bukayr narrates from him? 59. So again, one of the Mukthirun as well. طيب, all of that shows us that these narrations that were brought in Sahih from this Rawi were not that big of a deal. And again, the Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, both of them, they're doing intiqam, meaning they're bringing specific narrations where they felt Zuhair ibn Muhammad did not make a mistake. Okay, so this is all things you have to keep in mind, inshallah ta'ala. And you get more used to all of these things, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, the more you will get accustomed and the more you study, inshallah. In reality, like I said, guys, it's not black and white. So if Al-Hakim, for example, considers every single riwayah of Zuhair now acceptable and says, oh, that's a lot upon the shart of Shaykhain, that's not correct. That's incorrect. And Shaykhain only brought him, no, طبعا, the two of them, both Bukhari and Muslim, only brought one student of his each. So both ahadith in Bukhari were narrated from the same student of Zuhair. Both ahadith in Muslim, in fact, it was just one hadith in Muslim, narrated from one student of Zuhair. And they felt that narration was correct, and they were from the Iraqi. That narration was from the people of Iraq. طيب. So he says, أو في بعض البلدان. The third scenario is أو في بعض الأوقات. أو في بعض الأوقات. What's that scenario? Ibn Rajab rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, من ضعف حديثه في بعض الأوقات دون بعض. وهؤلاء هم الذين هم الثقات الذين خلطوا في آخر عمرهم. This is also very common. And when people grow older, they get weaker. And so maybe when they're older and they're still narrating, they make mistakes. وهم متفاوتون في تخليطهم. But then at the same time, they're not all the same level of mistakes. Some are making a lot of mistakes, some are making very less mistakes, some are making more mistakes, some are making less. فمنهم من خلط تخليطا فاحشا ومنهم من خلط تخليطا أو خلط تخليطا يسيرا ومن أعيان هؤلاء عطاء بن سائب الثقفي الكوفي إلى آخره. نعم. And this category as well, you find a lot of them where in as-sihah, like in Bukhari and Muslim as well. So in reality, like we mentioned, this idea of taḍʿīf as well, we have to understand that ضعف is not all the same. Okay. Now, it's possible that some individuals might mention fulan is ضعيف mutlaqan. But when you research more regarding fulan, you will find that fulan is not actually ضعيف mutlaqan. There's certain scenarios where he's ضعيف. So we're not going to consider, so again, you have to be conscious of this. Like, let's say, for example, someone comes to you and goes like, oh, Imam Bukhari brought a da'if narrator. Or aslan, yani, when you understand it like this, ahbab, this question is not a non-question. You're saying Imam Bukhari brought a da'if narrator, or Imam Bukhari brought a sahih narrator. Like, it doesn't work like that. It's not like Fulan is thiqa, therefore all of his ahadith are thiqa, or all of his ahadith are authentic, and Fulan is da'if, therefore all of his ahadith are uh, not authentic. That is a very amateur way of looking at this. There's so much more detail that's going into this, and the mind of the actual muhaddith or these musannifin. That's why we say, what made the whole world, praise Bukhari the way they praised it? The awam, they could know less. They wouldn't know anything. The ulama, why are the ulama, the great muhaddithun, praising Bukhari? They're not praising Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, because of simply, oh, he was only able to bring sahih narrations based on sahih and thiqat riwat. No. They're praising him because they recognize the intiqad that he did. That is the eye of the muhaddith. Like the ones that study ilm al-hadith, when they read and they study Bukhari from this qabil, not just, okay, what are the hadith saying, but actually looking from the perspective of who are the rijal mutakallim fihim in Bukhari, and when they see the intiqa, when they see the selection, when they see the beauty of how Imam Bukhari is bringing specific narrations of that rawi, then they're able to see that beauty. And based on that, they're like, no, this rajul kan allama, he knew what he was doing. He very much understood the inside outs of ilm al-hadith. So that is the first category. Or the second category was da'if muqayyad. The third category is الثالثة أن يكون تضعيفا نسبيا وهو الواقع عند المفاضلة بين راويين فأكثر، فهذا لا يلزم منه ثبوت الضعف المطلق في الراوي، بل يختلف الحكم عليه بحسب قرينة الحال في تلك المفاضلة. يا سلام. The third one, he says, is ضعيف نسبي. ضعيف نسبي is when you'll find, for example, a certain rawi هو أضعف منه. In the tarjama, you might find someone saying هو أضعف منه. But when he says هو أضعف منه, is he trying to say he's ضعيف? No. He could simply be saying Fulan is very strong and this person is lesser than Fulan. But he's also strong. He could also be strong. So ضعف nisbi, which is a relative ضعف, like in comparison to another rawi, you'll find in the books that Fulan is ضعيف. This is, you need to look further, you need to do further research. Like, what is the reality, or what is actually going on behind that rawi? Is he simply completely da'if, or is he partially da'if, or in some scenarios he's da'if, or were we just trying to say that compared to him he's da'if, or he's ad'af compared to him, so when they differ we're going to take Fulan, for example, but in general he's acceptable. واضح؟ طيب, he says ومثال ذلك, in the حاشية he says ومثال ذلك ما رواه عثمان الدارمي قال سألت ابن معين على العلاء وابنه كيف حديثهما. نعم, he said the two of them, العلاء and the son of Ala, Ibn al-Ala, how are their hadith? قال ليس به بأس. قلت هو أحب إليك أو سعيد المقبري. I said, is he more beloved to you than or سعيد المقبري? قال سعيد أوثق والعلاء ضعيف. طيب, look at this, in the same sentence literally. Initially when he was asked, he said ليس به بأس, no problem. Then he said right after that سعيد أوثق والعلاء ضعيف, even though he didn't say أضعف over here. He didn't say أضعف. Like in the siyaq, like if someone only took this, right, and it goes like, oh, Yahya ibn Ma'in says Ala is ضعيف. Okay, طيب, what about this? Why, if he was ضعيف, why did he say 2 seconds ago ليس به بأس? Because ليس به بأس is very different from huwa ضعيف. Okay, so when you look at now the mistake, one mistake that can happen over here is the naql. Naql is very dangerous. It hurts. Because let's say someone comes later on, like centuries later, and he looks at this and he does naql in his book. He says, "Yeah, قال يحيى بن معين هو ضعيف." هو ضعيف. Now he does naql directly from Yahya ibn Ma'in. He says huwa ضعيف. He doesn't tell you the context of it. He doesn't tell you the context of when he said he's ضعيف. He just said huwa ضعيف. Someone else comes and goes like قال يحيى بن معين ليس به بأس. That's it. That's all they write. Because these are mukhtasarat. So they're going through the actual books. They're just giving you the mukhtasar in the end. Okay. Someone comes along and says قال يحيى ليس به بأس. Now, in this scenario, you might think, if you don't go to the primary source, you might think that this is an ikhtilaf upon Yahya ibn Ma'in. In some versions, we have that Yahya ibn Ma'in is saying what? He's ضعيف. In some reports, we have that Yahya ibn Ma'in is saying he's ليس به بأس. Therefore, اختلف على يحيى. اختلف عليه. يعني regarding Yahya bin Ma'in we have اضطراب. Both opinions are narrated from Yahya bin Ma'in. Like, are both opinions actually narrated from Yahya bin Ma'in? No, they're not actually narrated, because this person didn't transmit the whole thing. He gave you a part of it. So you can never resort to the secondary sources. You have to go and find. That's why the first thing you must do before you even determine whether there are multiple reports from a given scholar of Jarḥ and Taʿdīl, or there's اختلاف and اضطراب from a given scholar of Jarḥ and Taʿdīl regarding a specific rawi, is that you have to find the most primary sources of where that scholar mentioned it. So you get the entire context. Because someone else can come later on and give you a part of that. That part could actually be misrepresenting what he actually intended. That's possible. طيب. قال الحافظ معلقا كما في تهذيب التهذيب: ترجمة العلاء بن عبد الرحمن يعني بالنسبة إليه، يعني كأنه لما قال أوثق خشي أنه يظن أنه يشاركه في هذه الصفة وقال إنه ضعيف. Okay. يعني in his ترجمة he said what? بالنسبة إليه، يعني بالنسبة إلى العلاء. As if Ibn Ma'in, when he said أوثق, he feared that someone might think that Ala is the same level of Sa'id. So he followed up by saying that no, إنه ضعيف. وقال السخاوي: فهذا لم يرد به ابن معين أن العلاء ضعيف مطلقا بدليل قوله أنه لا بأس به، وإنما أراد أنه ضعيف بالنسبة لسعيد المقبري، وعلى هذا يحمل أكثر ما ورد من اختلاف كلام أئمة الجرح والتعديل. يا سلام. ممن وثق رجلا في وقت وجرحه في آخر. نعم، هذا يكتب بماء الذهب يا إخوان، يكتب بماء الذهب. Remember this. He says وعلى هذا يحمل. نعم, not the whole thing, just وعلى هذا يحمل. The majority of the scenarios where you find that the ulama of jarh and ta'dil, the imam of jarh and ta'dil, in one place they're doing tawthiq of fulan, another place they're doing tad'īf of fulan, that is because the context is being misunderstood. And the problem is you're relying on the secondary sources. You're not finding the entire discussion. If you found the entire discussion, you'll be like, this is not even a khilaf. Someone for example, relayed the information from them. That can happen. But in reality, in of itself, is not actually a khilaf. It's not actually a khilaf. Naam. This happens. So this is the third scenario of ضعيف, which is ضعيف نسبي. طيب, then he says: وأما الموصوف بما يقتضي رد روايته فهو ضعيف جدا فمن دونه لا يقوي غيره ولا يتقوى بغيره. And if someone is ضعيف جدا, not level of موضوع or وضع or كذاب, but he's ضعيف جدا. Okay, not ضعيف, ضعيف جدا. So we don't say ضعيف regarding him, they add جدا after it. This is a level between ضعيف and between the totally not even considered. This level as well, we say, so anyone who's in the level of ضعيف, so based on that, the spectrum would be, right, if we went back to the initial spectrum, we had, that would be the center point. Everything here is accepted, over here is unaccepted. So you have, this is where we put talīyn, right, talīyn. Then we can say from this to here, that is just ضعيف مطلقا. Again, this is just تقريبا الفهم. This is what divides into three categories: 1, and then 2, and then 3. Right, the three categories that we mentioned. Now, what that means is that a rawi that can fall under this category sometimes can actually also be coming from a different category altogether at the same time. So there's two ways of looking at it. One is the spectrum changes based on scenario to scenario. Then over here, there's ضعيف جدا. Right. What's the difference between طيب, then obviously all the way in the end you have وضاع or كذاب, or very dangerous terms regarding them. Like, what's the difference between ضعيف جدا and ضعيف? We said ضعيف, the hukum regarding it is that تتقوى روايته. And if there's متابعة found, then we can, even if someone falls into this category, his riwayah, not internally, but through that متابع, it can actually become considered حسن للغير. As for ضعيف جدا, it can never get stronger. In fact, ضعيف مطلقا تتقوى, if you find someone who's a mutabi who's also ضعيف مطلقا, in that category, the two of them can come together and make the riwayah strong enough to become حسن للغير. That does not occur with ضعيف جدا. واضح. So he mentions over here فمن دونه لا يقوي غيره ولا يتقوى بغيره. Anyone who's ضعيف جدا or lesser than that, meaning وضاع or كذاب, they can't assist anyone else's riwayah, and neither can they gain strength through anyone else's riwayah. Like, with this, we finished the entire discussion regarding jarh. So what is jarh really? Istilahan, jarh would mean to classify. Yeah. To classify a rawi so that he falls in what category? everything beneath, everything beneath 50%, right? Or the acceptability rate, wherever we place that, everything on to the left of it or before it, to classify a rawi in a way that he falls under this category, that is what we call jarh. That is jarh. Now, that is of different levels. That could be, he could be, uh, we could say fihi lean, we could say fihi ضعف, and ضعف mutlaqan, and then that could be nisbi because it could be in different scenarios, or it could be ضعيف جدا, or it could be wada. All of this falls under the category of jarh. It's all actually a form of jarh. All of it actually is a form of jarh. That is the istilahi ma'na of jarh. طيب, in the next lesson, inshallah, we'll talk about the definition of ta'dīl. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.